In the summer of 1995, England was gripped by one of the deadliest outbreaks of bubonic plague in its history. Entire cities shuttered their doors, villages emptied, families fled into the countryside, hoping distance would offer protection. But one small village in Derbyshire did the opposite. Eyam did not flee or scatter. They stayed, shut down to protect others. And what followed was not an act of panic nor blind disobedience, but a deliberate and collective decision, one that would cost more than a quarter of the village its life. This is the story of Eyam, and of a choice so severe that history still struggles to decide whether it was heroic or unthinkable. You have tuned into Haunted Wavelength. My name is Darks, and tonight I will be your guide. Here we don't just tell stories, we step inside them. Before we begin, draw the curtains, dim the lights, settle in, and let me take you there. In 1665, Eyam was much like countless other English villages. A tight-knit farming and mining community, its people lived simple lives shaped by faith, routine, and the land itself. Most villagers were born there and expected to die there too. Travel was rare, wealth even rarer. Life was local, contained, and predictable. But far away in the crowded streets of London, something terrible was spreading. The Great Plague had came. By the summer of 1665, tens of thousands were already dead in the capital. Houses were marked, streets abandoned, entire families wiped out. Few believed the disease would reach a remote village tucked deep in the Derbyshire countryside. But diseases do not care for distance. And in late August of 1665, a small delivery proved just that. A box of cloth had been sent from London to a local tailor named Alexander Hatfield. London cloth was valuable, reused, reworked, and resold many times over and over again. In this time, when one would think deliveries of certain things, such as wool, that was the flea's favorite to hide in, would be monitored or completely shut down, but instead it was changed. Goods often went through a middleman. Trades were more quiet, often to avoid inspection. So a parcel would be easy to travel. And so it did, all the way from London to Eyam. The tailor, Hatfield, was away when that parcel arrived, so his assistant, George Vickers, opened the box. The cloth inside was damp, something unusual but not unheard of, and is well documented too. To dry it, George hung the fabric by the hearth, close to the fire. But he could not see where the fleas hidden deep in the folds that had fed on plague-infected rats in London. When the cloth warmed up, they scattered everywhere. And so within days, George Vickers fell violently ill. He died in agony. On September 7th, 1665, he became Eyam's first plague victim. His grave remained unknown to this day. Within weeks, others followed, and fear moved faster than the disease itself. Later retellings would add a haunting detail of this moment. According to oral tradition recorded decades afterward, some villagers claimed there had already been warnings about accepting goods from London, particularly cloth. In these versions, Vickers either never heard the warnings, dismissed it, or opened the parcel despite it, though there is no contemporary evidence to confirm this. What is known is simple and devastating. Once the cloth was unpacked, the plague took hold, and it did not let go. By autumn, the village was unraveling. Families whispered of God's punishment. Many believed the plague was divine wrath sent to close sin. Others spoke of poisoned air or unseen miasma drifting through homes. Some of the more fortunate villagers may have fled early, Records are scarce, but most could not leave. They had no money, nowhere to go, and nowhere that would welcome them. And when panic spreads and people flee, nearby towns take notice. In Sheffield, guards were posted, barriers erected, outsiders were turned away at gunpoint. Eyam people began to sleep in fields, caves, and open moors, hoping fresh air might save them. But by the end of October, nearly 30 were dead. Of course, winter slowed down the plague itself, just enough, so hope could return for a moment, but unfortunately, it would not last. In 1666, death surged again, and Eyam had to make a choice. Their new rector, William Mompesson, had arrived early, 2 years before the plague. He was young, educated, and deeply disliked. The village had strong Puritan roots, and Mompesson represented the restored Church of England after the fall of Cromwell. But by then, theology mattered less than survival, and Mompesson saw what others feared to say aloud. If Eyam fled, the plague would spread to Sheffield, Bakewell, and beyond. Thousands would die. And now entered the former rector, Thomas Stanley. Together, Mompesson and Stanley proposed something unexpected. The village would quarantine itself. No one in, no one out. They would accept death to save others. It was quite literally a choice to sacrifice themselves, and somehow they agreed. What makes the decision even more extraordinary is who made it. Now, I mentioned William Mompesson and Thomas Stanley, but the two men long stood on opposite sides of faith and authority within Eyam. Their rivalry was no secret, yet when the scale of the disaster became clear, both men reached the same conclusion. Whatever divided them before no longer mattered. And in June 1666, Eyam closed itself to the world. Boundary stones were placed around the village perimeter. Anyone crossing them broke the covenant. Food and supplies would be left at designated points. Payments would be made, too, in a genius way that actually helped to not spread the disease. At the village boundaries, shallow hollows were carved into stone, filled with vinegar, and used as exchange points for coins. Villagers left payment submerged completely in the liquid before stepping away to collect food, believing vinegar could cleanse corruption and disease. They had no knowledge of bacteria, fleas, or pathogens, yet vinegar's acidity does kill any microbes. By separating contact, disinfecting currency, and enforcing distance, Eyam unknowingly practiced a primitive form of infection control centuries before germ theory existed. It was not science as we understand it today, but it was observation, intuition, and survivor thinking at work, a community adopting in real time to an invisible threat. After this, church services moved outdoors to avoid enclosed spaces. Burials in consecrated grounds were stopped. Families were ordered to bury their own dead in gardens, fields, orchards. For many, this was worse than death itself. To be denied burial in holy ground meant eternal damnation. And yet they still stayed. Then came the heat. The summer of 1666 was brutally hot, perfect conditions for plague-carrying fleas. In June, over 20 people died. In July 56, in August 78, entire families vanished in days. One woman, Elizabeth Hancock, lost her entire family, her husband and 6 children, in just 8 days. Alone she dragged each body up the hillside and buried them herself. Villagers watched from far, too afraid to help. Another survivor, Marshall Howe, buried the dead for payment. He believed surviving once made him immune. He stole from the bodies, not thinking the items could have been infected too, that were stolen. Later, he buried his own wife and child he infected with the stolen items. By this time, Eyam lost over a third of its population. William Mompesson even begged her wife Catherine to leave, but she refused. Before everything hit, their children were sent away. Catherine stayed behind, nursing the sick and comforting the dying. One evening, walking through the meadows, she remarked on a strange sweetness in the air, and William knew what it meant. The sweet smell was a symptom of organ failure, the beginning of the end. Catherine died the next morning, aged only 27. She is the only plague victim buried in the churchyard, but William still continued, like everyone else in the village. As autumn approached, the deaths slowed down, and by November 1666, it was over. The last recorded victim was Abraham Morton, the 260th to die. Out of the population somewhere between 350 and 800, only about 90 survived. More than 70 families were completely erased, full bloodlines ended. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The plague had not spread to nearby towns. Eyam held the line. William Mompesson left the village years later. Sad reality of his was to live in isolation elsewhere. One village's hero feared as a man from the plague village. But Eyam was rebuilt. Today the boundary stones still stand, graves still lie on lonely hillsides, names etched into cottages mark where entire families vanished. Every year on the last Sunday of August, the villagers of Eyam observe Plague Sunday. Instead of a normal church service, the congregation walks up to Cocklet Delph, an old limestone ravine just outside the village. This was the open-air site where William Mompesson held services during the quarantine, so people wouldn't gather in enclosed spaces. There, an open-air memorial service is held to remember the 260 villagers who died, the sacrifice of the community, and the decision to stay isolated so others could live. This isn't a tourist spectacle. It's solemn, restrained, and deeply rooted in local identity. Around Eyam, several boundary stones still mark the invisible line the villagers swore not to cross during the plague. Today visitors still leave coins in the hollows, not as payment but as a symbol, a quiet gesture of respect. These coins rest in the same places where survival once depended on trust and distance, a gesture simple yet profound. Mompesson's well, too, remains a reminder of that extraordinary time. Here, supplies were exchanged without a word, money disinfected in vinegar, human contact minimized. Every coin, every careful action was a choice, a decision to act despite fear, to risk their own lives to safeguard their neighbors. And throughout the villages, plague cottages bear small plaques marking the homes where families were lost, where grief became daily life. In St. Lawrence's Church, the plague window captures the story in glass. The arrival of the infected cloth, the suffering endured, and the courage shown. The parish's plague register, preserved for centuries, lists name after name, date after date, the scale of tragedy, made real not by numbers but by the repetition of ordinary life cut short. The village of Eyam stands today quiet and beautiful, yet forever marked by the bravery of its people. Ordinary men and women faced with the unthinkable choose to stay. Their act of selflessness turned tragedy into a story of enduring humanity, a story still felt, still seen, and still remembered more than 3 centuries later. This has been Haunted Wavelength. Tonight's broadcast is over, but not the shadows that haunt the night. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, subscribe or follow, so you don't miss what awaits in the dark. Until next time, take care and listen closely. You never know what you might hear next.